Hi everyone! Today we are going to talk to the former journalist turned author. He wrote 3 books. The first about Vietnam, the second about the South China Sea, and the latest one about the invention of China. Today we're going to discuss the invention of China itself, the invention of its territory, the invention of maritime claims, and the invention of its sovereignty. Please welcome Bill Hayton. It's a fantastic book. It's a very interesting interview. Welcome to the show. Hi everyone.
Hello.
Today we have another guest in our show. It's Bill Hayton. He's a well-known author of few books about Asia. So he has one about Vietnam, one about the South China Sea, and the recent one about China. And that's the one we would like to discuss today. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Would you please say a few words about yourself?
Okay, I used to work for the BBC, and in that capacity, I was sent to Vietnam in 2006-07, and then wrote a book about Vietnam. And then when that was done, I wrote a book about the South China Sea, and that led me into various historical questions, which I realized had relevance to the broader history of China. So then I wrote this book, The Invention of China. I'm also an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. And I try to keep across developments in Southeast Asia mainly, but also to the extent that they relate to things in China.
Great. I would like to start with a chapter about invention of China and quote you a few sentences, which I really liked a lot. So you're starting with that the idea of China as a coherent territory with seamless history is not accurate, that East Asian heartland or the Qing Great State is more appropriate than China, because this term rather should be used rather after the creation of it in the declaration of the Republic in 1912. And you're saying that it shouldn't be, it's not a Western, the term empire, not in the Western sense, but rather the Chinese term daguo, like a great state. Us a little bit more how you, a little bit more about this chapter.
Okay, so the idea of the great state Daguo that you mentioned, I actually got that idea from Tim Brooke, who's written a book called Great State. And his argument is that this idea of great state was a particularly inner Asian idea, which emerges with the Mongols and is then adopted by other states that come after them. And it's a way of ruling a state that has many different component groups in it, people who speak different languages, different cultures. But it was a kind of flexible way of ruling. And so for the period between 1644, when the old Ming China is occupied by the Manchu people, right up until 1912, China proper, the old Ming state, was in effect a colony of a Qing great state, a state that was actually ruled by people who were not Chinese as we might understand it. But the process of the revolution in 1912 and the thinking that led up to that was about creating a new idea of a nation, a Chinese nation. And in effect, that Chinese nation, which is just one component part of the Qing great state, takes over the whole of the Qing great state, the Qing empire, if you like, and makes it Chinese. And that really is the root of the problems you see in Tibet and Xinjiang, and to a lesser extent in Mongolia. Manchuria, the fifth part, was the homeland of the Manchu people, but now, to all intents and purposes, is just another part of China.
Yeah, you're saying in the book that before the 20th century, no Chinese state has used the term to describe its territory, that it was only a name used by outsiders, and actually that it was something that was also promoted by the Chinese who lived abroad, by the Chinese community, and they actually, the impression that the Westerners had, a false impression of this unique Chinese culture, that was also promoted by the Chinese who lived abroad, and to distinguish there two terms, the Zhongguo as a central state of an idealized political hierarchy, and the other one is Zhonghua, like the center of civilization, superior over the barbarians in the hinterland. Would you say something about that?
Yeah, so we're often getting into the details of translation here,
Yes.
but so the word China in English, but you also see Xin in French or Cina in Italian and other European languages. This is a word that leaves China and comes to Europe and where it's adopted, and it takes on a whole set of meanings outside East Asia. So then, when Europeans go to East Asia, they arrive with an idea of this China place that they've read about, that they have heard legends about. And when they get there, they sort of think, well, okay, this must be China, and this must be a single coherent state, and it must conform to these expectations that I have. But of course, a lot of those Europeans were only really visiting the ports in southern China, and they they didn't really grasp the differences between those places they were visiting, their culture, their language, all the rest of it, and the other parts of the Qing Great State. There's another English word or word that's used in English, Cathay, which comes from the Khitan people, who are of Inner Asian people, and for quite a long time, in medieval and later periods in Europe, there was a sense that these two places, China and Cathay, were two different places, but in fact they were just basically different ways of reaching East Asia. If you went over land, you called it Cathay. If you went by the sea, you probably called it China, for example. But obviously in Chinese, they're not using these terms. So as you mentioned, Zhongguo, literally central state, or perhaps even the state at the center of the world. That's its sort of implication, or maybe just the central state in a kind of place that's surrounded by others. And Zhonghua, the idea of Hua as being a kind of higher state of civilization, if you like, cultured. That these were rival names for a potential nation state. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there's actually a very vigorous debate among reformists and revolutionaries in China and people outside China as to what they should call their new state once they've overthrown the Qing Empire. So bound up in all this is this idea of centrality and culture and civilization. And actually in that debate, what they're doing is really taking on a lot of ideas of China from outside the country. And that's why I think the importance of the overseas Chinese is really crucial here. A lot of these ideas were developed by people who were in
Yes.
the US or Canada or Europe or Hawaii or Southeast Asia, and they were looking back at their homeland in a completely different way to the people who were actually inside the country.
Yeah, and in the later chapters, you also mentioned Japan and Germany, but we can pick up on that a bit later. So we could say that the modern understanding of China as a source of a regional order is a distinctly modern invention. So I have one more question regarding this chapter. How come that the Western sinologists, I mean, we might understand that they got it wrong before, like decades or centuries earlier, but how come even 2 or 3 decades before we had this same fairy tale like image of China? Like they should have known it before then. So how come it's still kind of, most people probably think of China this way? How come there is still no clarification? The truth is not out.
It's a really interesting story, and I think there's probably several layers to it, several different strands to the story. One, I think, is that a lot of academics were heavily invested in China themselves. A lot of them were children of people who had worked in China. Maybe their parents had been missionaries, or their grandparents, or business people, or diplomats, or soldiers, perhaps in some of them. And I think, for example, John Fairbank, who's the sort of the most important figure maybe in this early period of sinology, he's one of those people. And there was also a lot of political hope. I think that China was going to emerge from the Second World War, or actually even earlier than that, was going to be this sort of this non-colonial state. It was going to be sort of a partner of the United States in creating a new Asia. So there's a lot of hope was invested in China in that sense. And so there was, people were very happy to go along with this sort of story of the reforming China that had emerged from this backward feudal past and was moving towards modernity. And they didn't need to look too carefully at these kind of national questions. Another issue, I think, is that all of these people were sinologists. They read Chinese. They didn't read Manchu. And so it's taken another generation. And I think actually, although I'm not so expert on this, I think the role of Japanese academics here in reading Manchu and reading some of these other documents opened a different way of looking at the past. And then those skills, the ability to read Manchu, for example, moved into American academia. And so you get what's called the new Qing history developing, particularly in North American universities, looking again at this at the past, and then that affects the way that people think about the nationalist movement and afterwards.
Thank you. Okay, now I would like to talk about the other chapter, Invention of Sovereignty. And you're saying in the chapter that even this term was introduced to the Qing rulers by a Westerner. And you start the chapter with a description of a conference in Copenhagen 2009, and then versus the other one in Paris in 2015. And this you use this example to talk about sovereignty and how it's understood by the current regime in Beijing. Could you also please talk about this a little bit?
Right, so those two conferences were climate change conferences, and they were attempting to get a global deal about how countries' carbon emissions should be measured and monitored. And in 2009 in Copenhagen, it's famously a bit of a disaster. President Obama went, but they couldn't get an agreement. There were 6 years of discussions, and the key to it was a deal between President Obama and the Chinese leadership. And then what that it allowed was a deal at the 2015 climate conference. And the difference between the two, the only real difference was that in the first one, there was going to be an international inspectorate that would go around all of the countries and measure their carbon emissions and report back publicly and say, you're not doing enough, or whatever, you're on the right track. Whereas in the second deal, 6 years later, the only difference was that countries themselves would be allowed to report their own emissions. And so there was going to be no outdoor inspection, so external, so foreign inspection. And I was looking really for an example of where sovereignty was really the most important point in Chinese policy. And so this isn't about human rights or kind of multi-party democracy or something like that. It's purely about how the state is dealt with in an international setting. And this idea that sovereignty, that the power of the state to rule its own destiny and not be subject to outside criticism or intervention, that was the number one thing which was the difference between the 2009 deal and the 2015 deal. And this, I think, allowed me to show how the importance of sovereignty in Chinese nationalist thinking, which goes right back to the middle of the 19th century, remains an absolutely firm force in Chinese politics today.
Because you define in the book the term sovereignty, it consists of two parts. You say it's a Confucian chauvinism and American legalism. And the second part, it melts pre-modern Chinese ideas of Zhongguo with Western ideas of fixed borders. So what you're saying then, you're talking about Xi Jinping, that he actually, by promoting this sovereignty and this Chinese independence, he actually promotes kind of a Western idea and project, which is kind of ridiculous that he pays so much attention to something that actually was introduced to China from the West or by the West.
Yeah, and actually, I think this is true of quite a lot of Chinese nationalist thinking, to be honest, is that they are taking a set of ideas that emerged in the West and developed through contact with Chinese reformers and revolutionaries, and really kind of putting it on a pedestal or setting it in stone and saying, this is how you are Chinese. But in fact, what they're really doing is just adopting a series of Western ideas in many ways. And so sovereignty fits into this. I think there's something, and I haven't really quite got to the bottom of this, is the way that the Western concept of sovereignty was absorbed into pre-existing ideas about the specialness of China, this idea of Hua as being civilized, as being kind of above everybody else, and how the two sort of somehow mix together as sort of like two different ways of approaching the same kind of idea, that the ruler should be kind of sovereign within their state. But we didn't have the idea of the fixed boundaries under the sort of the old way, if you like, of the Confucian way of looking at the world. You had the idea that that Hua civilization would kind of roll on, to the ends of the earth, really, where sovereignty is about literally drawing a line, a boundary, a border around that power, and saying nothing can come in. Whereas, of course, the modern world that's developed is, we have sovereignty, but we also have kind of shared sovereignty. We have alliances, we have trade deals, we have all these kind of things which, reduce the power of sovereignty to some extent. We submit to or some countries, allow courts to kind of rule on internal issues, whether they be human rights courts or in the EU business courts, for example. And so, the Europeans having kind of really developed this idea of sovereignty, and people may have heard of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1649, and the idea of what happens within a boundary is the sole preserve of that state. And Europeans have moved away from that idea, whereas China is really holding fast to that idea.
Yeah, you're describing in the book how the Qing court really doesn't understand those Western concepts, even when talking to Japanese, who kind of already understood what it is. They still didn't know how to deal with when they were signing, agreements, losing Taiwan. That was all kind of then beginning to dawn on them that that's a different concept, but they still didn't understand it, right?
Yeah, so you have this idea that the emperor, sort of sitting at the center of this power, receives the allegiance, the tribute from surrounding powers. Now, a lot has been discussed and argued about over this concept, this idea of tribute. But I think what's really important is that it was important for the political legitimacy, the domestic power of the emperor and the imperial court, that other countries came and paid homage, that it was seen to raise the status of the emperor. And if they didn't do that, then the emperor's power at home diminished. And so anything which took away these tributaries from the center damaged the domestic politics of the empire and the emperor's personal standing. So, for example, in the late 19th century, when you get an argument over the Ryukyu Islands, and the Japanese new modern state tries to kind of take them over and take them away from their old tributary relationship with Beijing, and the same thing with Korea, and the same thing with Southeast Asia. It's not so much the material damage that this does in terms of, say, trade, for example, but the fact that it undermines the sort of self-image of the emperor as the head of a regional system. And so it's a really difficult arrangement for the Chinese, if you like, to understand, and because it involves a fundamental break with the past, and there's a setting of borders, where countries and territories are one side or other of a border, whereas up until that point, the people in the Ryukyu Islands had been able to play one side off against the other. They could kind of do tribute to both China and to Japan, and basically be a sort of middleman in the trade between the two of them. But once Japan grabbed them, forced them to kind of be part of Japan or Japan's sphere of influence, that traditional link with the emperor was broken.